These are the Zagros Mountains in southwest Iran. Rugged, unforgiving terrain. It was within these mountains that a U.S. airman climbed 7,000 feet, badly injured, bleeding, and with a bounty on his head after ejecting from his F-15E Strike Eagle, which was shot down by a shoulder-fired missile in southwest Iran. The first airman, the pilot, was rescued within hours. The second airman was rescued within 48 hours on Easter Sunday in an operation involving more than 100 aircraft and 100 special forces like those we're showing now. Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump describe the rescue like this.
In a daring 14-hour rescue operation, 7 hours in daylight and 7 hours of night, both pilots were recovered safely. Not once, but twice. A daylight thunder run right up the middle of their country. Boots on the ground. A midnight raid right up the middle of their country. Boots on the ground. 0 American casualties.
We're here today to celebrate the success of one of the largest, most complex, most harrowing combat searches. I guess you would call it a search and rescue mission ever attempted by the military.
Why was this operation the most daring in U.S. military history? What were the elements of its success? And why are some asking whether it was a cover for another operation? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Mark Montgomery, retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral, and Tony Hu, former U.S. Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia. A very warm welcome back, Mark.
Thank you for having me today.
And also Tony.
Thank you, Ian.
Okay, so let's hear Trump's account of the moment the CIA confirmed they had the missing airman.
He was 40 miles away, and he said, you know, we're seeing something moving up in the mountain. This is at night. And they kept the camera on him for 45 minutes. He wasn't moving, and they said, you know, probably wrong, but we're seeing something moving. This is a vast mountain, vast, thick, with bushes, trees. He said, we see something moving 40 miles away. It was the head of a human being, I'm telling you, it's moving. And then all of a sudden, 45 minutes later, he moved a lot. He stood up, and they said, we have him.
So, Tony, it was described by Trump as an Easter miracle and also going down in the history books. Why?
Yeah, this is tremendous because it is deep inside enemy territory that we had to go in to not only rescue him, we got to find him first and being able to positively identify him and bring him out. So it is a very difficult task. A lot of forces were brought together, timing, to have this rescue plan to come together in it by itself with so many different forces coming together. It is amazing by the fact that the plan was drawn up and executed in such a way that it was a successful mission.
And Mark, finding a needle in a haystack, or as one of the, I think the CIA director said, it was like finding a single grain of sand in the desert.
Yeah, this was a very exceptional combat search and rescue operation, and I think the people who executed it, the warfighters, deserve a lot of credit. I think the president is slightly rhetorical when he says the greatest ever. We've had some amazing recoveries in the Vietnam War, by Clyde Lassen, and the Korean War by Thomas Hudner. These are famous historical stories. Yes. I know the president doesn't know the history of our military very well. There's been a lot of great combat search and rescues, and this team built on that, and they did a fantastic job. What's impressive was that the pilot was able to stay alive for that period of time. That's the hard part. The really hard part was the climb he made and the recovery he made. And so, yes, it was a Easter miracle for that pilot and his family, and it fits in a long history of successful combat search and rescues carried out by the United States Air Force and Navy.
Okay, and Mark, on that, if it hadn't been successful, what would have been the stakes for the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a great question. He's a senior officer.
A colonel.
A colonel. So that ironically, it means that he's had other jobs besides flying where he did important work, dealt with highly classified information, potentially acquisition work or operational planning work. So he was a very lucrative target to China and Russia, the partners of Iran. And there's no doubt that had he been captured, he would have been made available to them. So this was a big deal for him, his family, his unit, but then more broadly for the Air Force and for the Joint Force that we recover him.
Mm-hmm. Tony, I mean, what sort of message does it send Iran, China, Russia?
Well, we let the world know that we're the only one with that kind of capability, because the first rescue in and by itself is tremendous because it was done in daylight. It was a pre-dawn raid, so it was nighttime when they ejected, and I believe that's the reason why the colonel got hurt, because at nighttime when you come down on a parachute, you want to see where the land is, so you know when you're going to hit and roll. At nighttime, you can't see that. So that's very dangerous, and we're very lucky the front seater survived and was picked up during daylight, because usually after a crash, within the first 6 hours or so, if you can save them, their survival rate is high. But after those time, then the probability of survival or return gets low very quick, because the enemy gathered and the initial surprise is gone. So this other nighttime rescue is truly a magnificent feat that they accomplished.
Right.
You know, can I pick up on that? I'll just say that China and Russia should take a lot. Look, they should take a lot from the last 40 days. This was 40 days of the United States military imposing its will with 1,000 strikes a day. I don't know that even when I was in, I did a lot of operational planning and execution of war plans. I would have never seen this hard, this thick a strike plan for 3 or 4 days. But to do it for 40 days, first of all, the Chinese and Russians are absorbing that, re-understanding that the United States is a uniquely equipped military power. But then to do this, as Tony said, in daylight, to do a second one 36 hours later at a distance, some distance away, that says we control everything in your country. And your systems are not functional to stop us from doing it. And to have no human casualties other than the ejected pilot says a lot about U.S. military capability and capacity, and is a strong warning to China and Russia that we're probably not the right country to mess around with.
And yet, Mark, there are some people sort of taking issue with statements from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, saying, well, obviously there isn't air supremacy, perhaps, rather than superiority, because it was struck down in the first place. What do you say to that?
Yeah, air superiority or air control, neither one of those terms implies the enemy can't shoot at you. The enemy preserved a high-quality man-portable weapon, and then used it at the right time. That's going to happen. That's built into our risk management. Our risk management for every flight is the likelihood that the plane gets shot down. Now, if you're in a B-2 or an F-35, you kind of imagine it to be different because of the altitude you fly at and the stealth in your aircraft. The F-15 is not afforded that on this kind of mission. Neither is the A-10 that was shot down. You know, it was intentionally at low altitude looking for the pilot. It was going to be at risk. So I worry about the pilots in those cases. There's a risk to force, to the humans, to the people, when you do these kind of missions, but there's not a risk to mission. We can execute our mission because we have air control and at some points air superiority and air dominance.
Okay, just turning to a story that has emerged. Some independent analysts and a lot of Iranian sources, they're claiming that the rescue was actually a cover for a different operation, and one that was targeting Iran's enriched uranium. Okay, Mark?
These might be the same forces you would use for that, but this was not a cover. We wouldn't have risked the pilot by having another operation going on. I would say in my military career, I heard 100 conspiracies and 100 of them were false. The military is great at telling conspiracy theories.
Which we'll get onto later as well.
And one other thing I'll tell you, though, is the president, we know he can't keep a secret. We would know by now if he had done something else at the same time. So I don't believe in this. I don't believe this has been a conspiracy. I believe this was executed. There may have been errors or forced distances put into where some locations were, which I agree. But I don't think this was a cover for that. I will say these are the same forces we would use for an attack at Pickaxe Mountain, one of their nuclear facilities. But that's a distance away from this.
Right.
So if you can just comment on Kuwait as a staging ground as opposed to within Iran itself. What's the advantage of being within Iran?
they needed the range, to be within the range of the little bird, so that it could get around quickly, get back, get fuel from the C-130 where on the ground.
On the ground, yeah.
And look, they knew. I think when they landed these planes, they knew there was a percentage chance that they weren't going to take back off. You're landing on a farm field. You don't know the amount of rain that's happened over the days and weeks ahead of that.
But then, truly, if the land is wet and if you don't have a pre-survey, then it results in that. And Admiral Montgomery is absolutely right. When we have a search and rescue mission, it takes priority. So all resources get devoted in that. And it's hard to imagine, actually, we would divert resources to another operation when our number one objective is to get the guy out.
Okay. Now, in order to bring their servicemen and women home during a conflict, the U.S. military trains them in advance in a program known as Survival, Evasion, Resistance and Escape, or SERE. They become proficient in building shelter, surviving in water, preparing food and water, escaping, and more.
Despite incoming fire and unforgiving conditions, our troops brought every American home. No American lives were lost. We leave no man behind, and that is not luck. It's the result of unmatched training, superior technology, an unbreakable warrior ethos, and sheer American grit.
Okay, so Mark, I mean, you've been, as well as Tony, in service for the U.S. military. Can you give us a sense of, that 48 hours for the colonel, both physically and mentally?
This had to be challenging. There's an adrenaline rush, I'm sure, both from flying in combat, from the ejection, from the injury, all of those building up together. He must have been in a significant adrenaline condition. And then as it wears off, as he as he starts to recognize what his condition is, which is that he's wounded, trapped, several hundred miles behind adversary lines, now in approaching daylight, then, probably some level of fear that you have to control, that it doesn't become panic. And then that's why we do the training we do. And he, my guess is, he thought about his family, he thought about his unit, and he thought about maneuver, how to get to the high ground.
So getting to the high ground, Tony, was about enabling the U.S. military to track him,
Well, actually...
or was it to escape from the
with the new
local
system
militia?
that we have, it's not absolutely necessary, because when we use the old radio, the PRC-112, you have line of sight communication. The new C-cell radio have SATCOM, so you don't necessarily need to get to the high ground. But when we talk about the pilot, usually what happens is once he lands, he has to think about survival, number one. Okay, so he go through himself where he's hurt, stop the bleeding. Okay, then gather his stuff, hide it. Then he wants to think about evade, the second step. After you survive, you want to evade. So you find a place, hide, and take a collection of what you have in your survival suit. Your water, your food, your first aid, your pistol, how many bullets, and of course, turn on your CISO, your combat survival evader locator, the new radio. The good thing about that new radio is it's automatic as far as locating, responding to an interrogation from someone coming to rescue you. If they interrogate that radio, you don't have to be answering or responding. It automatically sends back a signal on where you're at.
Mark, you mentioned it before, the fact that he managed to stay alive. And I think actually General Kane, Dan Kane, emphasized that too. So can you talk to this resistance mindset as part of SERE?
Yeah, I think it teaches you, it gives you confidence. The school gives you confidence that you can survive this kind of situation. I promise you, whatever scenarios you go through in the school, it's not the exact one that happens in real life. I think it taught him that he needed to get clear of the adversary. He needed to be aware of whether he had a blood trail. He had to take certain precautions. He doesn't want to use his gun. That's the last thing you want. I agree with Tony that you need to have it. You need to understand how many rounds you have. But once you start using that, you're going to have a whole heap of problems. With the adversary, with the enemy. So your goal is not to be located by them. I assume that's why in his evasion, he went up, because for someone who's wounded, that was a pretty good.
7,000 feet.
Yeah, and to get up slightly into the mountains. And I think the idea, what he had there was he wanted to be able to have situations where he has to look for aircraft without being spotted by others. And he's very lucky. I mean, this appears to be a national forest, a national park that he's generally on the edges of in his location. I mean, I can't think of a better place to be. By the way, that's where we do a lot of our survival, escape, rescue, resistance, and and evasion training are in these mountains, are in this kind of area because the government is able to use them without affecting the private sector. So ironically, he probably had some very good training for this exact condition he found himself in.
Right. And Tony, the motto, we leave no man behind. Tell us why this is so powerful in this circumstance. I just want to quote from General Frank McKenzie. He's credited with saying it takes a year to build an aircraft, but it takes 200 years to build a military tradition where you don't leave anybody behind.
Absolutely. This is something that when we join the military, it's a promise our country made to us that we fight. We have a military code that we know we're American fighting men, okay? And we will fight if necessary. We will defend our country with our life. And also, we will never surrender our men if we still have the way to resist. And this is the thing that we know. We keep our promise, our government will keep their promise to come get us. And as you know, I served 1 year in Hanoi doing the Joint Task Force for Accounting to recover those Americans that even 40 years after the Vietnam War, we're still looking for them. So this is something that we know our country will bring us back. In no matter what, they'll bring us back.
Okay. Now, we've spoken about a couple of, quote, exquisite technologies the U.S. used in the mission already, but let's hear what Trump says about a certain helicopter known as Little Bird.
Couldn't have lived without them. They did, and they performed unbelievably well. And if you'd see it, you wouldn't believe it. They came off the plane, and these guys had them. The rotors were off. They rebuilt these helicopters in less than 10 minutes.
So the president goes on to emphasize that I think they're MH6s, is that right? Mm-hmm. They're unbelievably powerful, but very small, and their ability to get to certain places. The idea that they can be taken, transported on the C-130s and then assembled in less than 10 minutes. I mean, what sort of technology is that?
When the president says they're exquisite technology, it's the technology on board them and that our warfighters are equipped with that's exquisite. It's constant updates, constant utilization, the sensors, the infrared sensors, the acoustic sensors. That's what's unique about these. And then, of course, the training of the men and women that do it. Mm-hmm. And I'll just add to General McKenzie's, it takes a year to build an aircraft. I'll tell you, it takes 10 to 15 years to build a skilled special operator to really fly these and use these. I guarantee you one of the two pilots had 15 to 20 years. Oh, yeah. The men who happen to be leading the SEAL team, the leaders of them had 10 to 15 years. Yeah. A lot of experience.
Tell us a little bit more about the Night Stalkers and their expertise. Yeah.
So the Night Stalkers are the Army Special Forces squadron that they're associated with Special Operations Command. They were extensively used in Venezuela. In fact, in Venezuela, I would say they had an even more impressive assault, for which one of their members, one of the lead pilots, got the Medal of Honor from the President at the State of the Union. But we see them again. We've been using them extensively, since the early 1980s when they were organized the way they're organized, and even before that. But they were used in Panama. They were used in Desert Storm. They were used in Afghanistan and Iraq. So really, they're the elite of Army rotary wing aviators.
Okay. Tony, does this rescue operation say anything about the superiority of U.S. systems compared to that of, say, Chinese, Russian systems? Because we know that Iran was using China's Beidou navigation, I think, system, and also drones, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that makes us special is that our system, when we develop them, we think about expeditionary, reaching out long distance. And then we go through a significant developmental and operational testing. They go through very, very rigorous testing before we give it to the warfighters. Where other countries might not, and you know, recently in China, for example, Xi Jinping got rid of even their stealth fighter J-20 designer because they fake data. They fake performance data. That's why you see some of the stuff in Venezuela and now in Iran just didn't perform as advertised. So I think that this type of performance, once again, confirms that we have better quality and we have better capability. And when we say they can do it, they can do it. And when China and Russia say they can do it, maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, because Mark, I mean, are the odds against the Americans in rescuing this airman or against the Iranians? I mean, do you think it was against
They should have been against the Americans. And the other thing you got to remember is the Americans were already 12,000 miles away from their home base. So that's what the notice to Russia and China is. The United States still has the ability to project significant amounts of power 8,000, 12,000 miles away, and then use that power in an aggressive manner that, over 40 days, that your forces have never been able to execute. And the Russians have tried for the last 4 years in Ukraine, and the Chinese really have never tried. I think it's a strong message. If I was Xi Jinping, the performance of the equipment, as Tony mentioned, that should bother me. The performance, the America's ability to play an away game, and Donald Trump's willingness to use the force against an authoritarian regime. These are all strong signals to China that they should not do anything unexpected or untoward towards Taiwan. And I know people are worried about we've used munitions. We can purchase munitions faster and better over the next 2 to 3 years, and our munitions will be fine. The principle that the United States is willing to go to war to impose its will on an authoritarian state that's doing the wrong thing. And remember, Iran got Trump's ire because they killed 30,000 protesters in 2 days. That was the breaking point for him. If China does something inappropriate to Taiwan, China now has to factor in that there's a likelihood that Donald Trump will take action. That's important, and that's why Taiwan and the United States have to work very hard in the forthcoming years to make sure that our forces are as integrated and coordinated as U.S. and Israeli forces have been over the last 40 days. There's a lot of lessons learned for this from Taiwan, and most of them are good.
Okay, so let's quickly cover off the deception campaign, Tony. Tehran had basically set a around about $60,000 US bounty on this airman's head. So one of the tactics the US used was subterfuge. Can you tell us about the details of that?
Well, actually, in every war plan, there's a deception section. That's the way we fight, okay? We want to cause the enemy to divest the resources to a location where we are focusing on. So it is a standard operating procedure most of the time that we don't hear about, except this time it became public. Most of the time, the deception activity remains undercover, and its effect, we can feel the effect, we can see the effect. Well, just like during the Gulf War, we did a deception. We had a Marine faking that we're ready to do landing in Kuwait and tied up the whole Republican Guard division while we did a left arm and came around the desert. Same thing. So every war plan we have has that deception component, even with this search and rescue operation. So our enemy shouldn't be surprised with that. And usually we don't go too deep into our deception activities. So I'm glad that this is happening, but I'm also surprised that it came to public that we did that, specific act.
Yeah, so to that point, why?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Look, I'll say the president routinely talks about things that I'm surprised. Sometimes humorously, like he called whatever our weapon was in Venezuela the discombobulator.
Yeah.
And that's where he talked here about, potentially, sensors that can detect pilots and things. And, the president needs to get that he's not the one who leaked this. This was leaked elsewhere. It's inappropriate. I do think we do deception. I will point out that this was done by the intelligence community. Our military tries not to practice this because the military will tell the truth, and I just think that's our best pattern. So when we do influence operations, it might be that you don't know who's telling the truth, but we're telling the truth. We try. It's not appropriate for the military to lie, whereas the intelligence communities are authorized to do that. And this was a lie in the furtherance of a very noble effort, which is to recover this pilot. So I think they did a fantastic job, and I'm not surprised as the CIA. I am surprised it leaked. Like, the military leaks.
Yeah.
The president leaks aggressively. The CIA does not historically leak.
No.
And so I was surprised that this leaked out.
And finally, Mark, Iran has been talking for a while now. It wants to tax the ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Is this legal?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things in the ceasefire agreement that are confusing. One of the ones that worries me most is the idea that Iran would tax ships as they go through an international strait, like the Straits of Hormuz. That's illegal. The Omanis were right to walk away from that and say, we're not part of that. I was surprised that the president entertained it. And so far, though, he hasn't embraced it. I hope Vice President Vance in his negotiation says that's off the table. We will not participate in a clearly illegal scheme that violates the freedom of navigation and innocent passage through the straits by merchant ships. And then I would say that clearly he then has to point out to them that if they try to do it, we will hold them accountable.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much, Mark Montgomery and Tony Hu, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. See you next time.